Thanks everyone for coming. I'm just happy that I successfully negotiated this chair, which is very close to the edge. So I'm glad we're not in earthquake country, which is where I live. Thank you, it's always on my mind. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and of course to KUOW for hosting us. I had a super fun day at the station today. It's outstanding. And I am excited about tonight's conversation, so let's get to it. On my show, so what's gonna happen is that I have about a 7-minute presentation. I'm really proud of this because I said it would be 7 minutes, and when we timed it earlier, it was 6 minutes and 50 seconds because I am awesome at radio. So I have about a 7-minute presentation just sort of setting up the overarching themes of our conversation tonight about the data economy. And we're gonna bring our panelists one at a time, late night talk show style, talk to them for 10 minutes or so about what they're doing, and then have a group discussion followed by a question and answer with all of you. It's gonna be fascinating. Our panelists are brilliant, and I'm super excited to talk about this topic because it is the topic that never stops giving. Privacy. On my show, Marketplace Tech, our tagline is that we're trying to demystify the digital economy, and that means helping people understand this business model. And I feel like we are at a time when everyone is collectively starting to realize the business model of the web and the impact that it has on all of our lives. So in tonight's conversation, we're gonna talk about these trade-offs that are part of the data economy. And the big trade-off really is the bargain that you thought you were making, which was, I will trade some of my personal information and I'll get a free service out of it. And that was a pretty straightforward bargain. Versus the bargain that you really made, which was, I will turn over all of my personal information, not just to one company, but to a company that might monetize it by handing it over or selling it to multiple other companies, and that I will be trading way more information than I thought I was. I think that's the realization a lot of us have come to. And so our question is, simply put, is this a fair trade? And it's a super appropriate time to have this conversation because we're coming up on what is basically the 1-year anniversary of Cambridge Analytica and that realization. So let's go back in time a little bit to a moment when I think we learned a lot about the business model of the services that we use every day. And is this guy. You knew that was coming. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, but he had a very revealing exchange last April when he appeared on Capitol Hill.
How do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see.
That was Senator Orrin Hatch asking, I mean, we're chuckling, people were chuckling, Twitter was chuckling. But let's be honest, do you feel like you really understand how Facebook makes money? Because a lot of people don't. And so after that exchange, I got this tweet from a friend of mine who's a very accomplished tech reporter and said he was staggered by the lack of understanding of the business model. And frankly, I thought that moment was a win for Senator Orrin Hatch because it was the first time that Mark Zuckerberg did not say, we connect people. We create communities. We make it easier for you to talk to your friends. You know, we organize the world's information like Google would have said. He said, we run ads. And that was a really revealing moment for a lot of people because that's the moment when we started to realize that what they meant by that was we target ads for stuff you think you might want. We're the reason that the same ad is following you all over the internet. We will do anything to get more information about you so that we can target these ads. And that could include paying teenagers to download research apps that record everything they do. It could mean grabbing information about your friends and your friends of your friends, getting information from your cell phone carrier, buying information from third-party data brokers, your credit card company, the stores you shop at, the pet food place. Facebook will literally, like these companies were saying, we will literally manipulate your feelings as a research experiment to get more information to use to target ads to you. And we have promised other companies and political campaigns that our targeting is so good that it can actually affect your behavior. And so even though we all chuckled at this moment, I think it's the moment when we all realize that we're living in what I like to call the data economy. And I got a new slide. It was like magic. You, I'm sure, have heard this term, the data is the new oil. And that is what is making all of this run. And there have been a couple moments in the past few years when we realized, I think, the import of that. The Equifax hack was a moment. And then, of course, as you're going to hear in this next clip, the 2016 election and the Cambridge Analytica revelations were a huge turning point.
It's like the data equivalent of Fukushima. And when you think about something like Fukushima or Cambridge Analytica, it's a big hot point, and we take notice. I mean, everybody notices that this is going on. But like, if you take a nuclear disaster, it isn't just about that hot point. It's about a bigger question of how we produce energy and just the whole economy. I think we know we're making data every day, maybe. We probably don't think about it much, but we definitely don't step back to look at that bigger picture of the data-driven advertising economy.
So there are a whole bunch of factors that led us to step back and look at that whole advertising economy, which is part of what we're doing tonight. And look, I have to be honest, there were plenty of people also after the Cambridge Analytica hack who said, and in fact, I know a woman who's a small business owner and who said to me, I should probably be advertising on Facebook. Seems like this stuff really works. That is a reality of this conversation too, that I hope we're gonna have. But now we're trying to grapple with this new reality, and here's the thing, it's only gonna get worse. Like way worse. You had to know artificial intelligence was coming. You don't get a bunch of geeks on stage and not talk about AI at this point. Everyone is trying to develop or sell an artificial intelligence or machine learning solution. And all that is using huge amounts of data to draw conclusions and or make predictions faster and better and more efficiently than a human can do it. And a lot of these conclusions are great, right? It might be language translation or medical diagnosis or real-time mapping and traffic rerouting or logistics and supply chain analytics or plagiarism detection. But it all relies on huge amounts of data. The real-time traffic information comes from millions of smartphones sending real-time location information to the mothership all day, every day. You have companies now who are bemoaning the problem of what they call dark data. This is just the stuff they don't know about you yet, and it drives them crazy. Because you can't have computers making really great predictions unless you have all of the information. And so as these technologies become a bigger and bigger part of their lives, and they will, then that raises this new question. What's next? And people are starting to, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's also a question that people are starting to answer in some different interesting ways, including, should I be getting paid for this data? Which you could argue is kind of a radical idea, but maybe it's the time to think about it.
Well, you know, everybody is worried about AIs coming to displace their jobs and to take away their employment opportunities. And yet, if you work at one of these tech companies like I do at Microsoft, you know that what makes machine learning systems that are supposed to replace your jobs in the future work is all of the data that individual people are supplying. You have these giant companies producing these amazing digital services and entirely forgetting about all the people who contributed the value to make them possible.
So Glenn Weil co-wrote a book called Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. And one of the entire chunks of that book is about the idea that we are all working as unpaid data laborers. And when I talked to Glenn, maybe a year ago, 8 months ago, that was a really radical idea. It was a fun thought experiment. You know, he suggested that, you know, let's say if I know, when it comes to training AI systems, if I know Farsi, that's a high value skill. Maybe I could get paid a little more for that. Or if my son will not stop playing Fortnite, and he will not, I'm failing, that he could potentially also be cracking codes while he's playing Fortnite. He could be putting those skills to use, and that might actually give him some value and also be awesome for me. Could contribute to the rent for once. But it does come back to this idea that we are starting to consider radical solutions, that we're starting to consider how to come at this question of the bargain. And we are seeing people put forward solutions. This is why the GDPR in Europe, their big general data privacy regulations have come to pass. That's why California is passing data privacy laws. Senator Amy Klobuchar in her presidential run talked about data privacy. The governor of California just suggested that perhaps our state should actually pay people a data dividend like the people who live in Alaska get an oil dividend. These are becoming much more serious conversations as we are talking about size and power. The FTC is holding new hearings to discuss whether our existing antitrust regulations and frameworks are enough to deal with companies that feel like a monopoly, except that they're kind of in everything. I mean, Amazon. It's not an obvious one, but it feels like it should be. There are hearings on social media and influence. You have Elizabeth Warren proposing to break up the biggest tech companies. All of this really is just about trying to grapple with these influences that feel totally out of our control. So it's no surprise that radical thinking is a part of that conversation. Okay, my 7 minutes are up. Let's start to dig into this with our panelists. Like I said, they'll come up one at a time and tell us what they're working on. We'll take some questions from the audience. And first up, Monica Nicholsberg, who you probably all know from GeekWire, civic innovation editor covering how tech and politics intersect. Hello, Monica.
Hello.
And before, I know, it's terrifying.
Good thing I wore my
Yeah,
climate
don't look at her.
shoes.
It's just gonna make it worse.
Nobody look at me.
Yep. Before actually Monica and I start talking, we have a fun exercise, which is, it's poll time. Apparently this is a thing at these events, and I'm very excited about this. Before we start talking, we want you to answer this question. We're gonna ask it now, and we're gonna ask it again at the end, like debate style, to see if you're convinced one way or the other. And we'll show you what the results are. So, we want to ask you a quick question, and that question is, do you think you're getting a fair trade for your data? And you are not. Okay, and also it is important to know that we will not be gathering your phone numbers. And when you text this number, which I did earlier, you'll get a little response back that says, don't worry, this is totally private, we're not harvesting your phone numbers. Even though I feel like we kind of should, it's like, because irony, but we're not. It would be on theme, exactly. It's a trade. You get, okay. So we are at a pretty solid no on the fair trade, which means we have some devil's advocate work to do, I think, right?
I'm here for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, everybody done voting? No? Everyone's still texting? All right. Do you think you're getting a fair trade? They get $1 billion. I get an ad for prettier shoes. What, I mean, the shoes are great, but I don't have $1 billion. No, I'm kidding. All right, you have 5 more seconds. Oh, it's creeping up. Yes, it's creeping up. I'm needling you. I did that on purpose. Because you know that what I really get is Facebook with the baby pictures and who got fat from high school. I mean, I do like that. Can I have it all? Okay. We're going to call off the voting, and then we're going to move to, we've got just a fun, like, surprising fact as a palate cleanser about data, which is hard for me to read from here, but Chinese police use facial recognition technology to pick out a single man suspected of economic crimes out of 60,000 people. If you really start to read about what China is doing with data and behavioral manipulation, then you start to see where this conversation ends, I think. So Monica, let's dive right in. You are our policy person. And so for table setting, I would like to know, is it gonna work?
Oh, starting with a softball, okay.
Yeah. I mean, is this something that regulation can hope to tackle at this point?
Well, I think that regulation should definitely try. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the benefits of regulation is it creates an even playing field. You know, you have companies that have really different ideology about these things. Microsoft has come out and said that they're very privacy forward. They want to convince you that they're going to handle your information well, and they're actually going to advocate for regulation. But not every company can do that, especially an upstart that's looking for every advantage that they can gain. So the thing that regulation accomplishes is it ensures that all of the competitors have the same rules and the same consequences if they violate them.
So I know you have been writing about all of this, and particularly GDPR, which was this sort of like earth-shaking thing for so many companies. Are you guys familiar with the GDPR? Hands, everybody is. You guys are so educated. I hope you didn't fall asleep during my 7 minutes, because clearly we're up on this already. How much of an impact do you think that is having now?
I think it can't be overstated, the impact that it's having, especially because these companies they don't like to do things in a piecemeal way. So many of them have just said GDPR is going to be our standard, and these protections are going to be available to all of our customers worldwide. So I think that is really one of the things that regulation can accomplish is if you have a big enough market like the European Union, then you can influence policy everywhere worldwide.
Yeah. What about the argument that compliance with GDPR is so hard for small companies and so easy for companies that have huge size and scale that it ends up almost benefiting them because it's much easier for them to do these data audits or figure out where everything is or be in compliance?
I mean, I think that is a fair argument, but it's something that could also be extended to so many of the rules of the road that apply to tech companies right now. And that's actually one of the things that Elizabeth Warren in her proposal has brought up, is that these big industry players have so much power and so much money that they can comply with any regulation. They can gobble up any competitor that even hints at wanting to enter into their business. So I don't necessarily want to make the case that more regulation is better, but I think that everyone agrees that just letting it be a complete Wild West is not really accomplishing what we want.
And then we are seeing some baby steps in the U.S. We're certainly California, because that's what we do.
California likes to take
Just
big baby steps.
like to
They're
take a large baby,
taking a
right?
big, you know.
like a 4-year-old step.
Yeah.
Do you think that is the goal of some of that regulation too, to have sort of a similar effect as, we talk about the auto standards all the time, influencing the rest of the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it says something that California was first and Washington wants to be second. California passed something that's pretty similar to GDPR. It's not quite as sweeping, and now there's a bill in Washington state that's cleared the Senate that seems to be getting a lot of traction, that's similar to California's law, similar to GDPR, with a few different facial recognition spices thrown in. But I think that companies are getting increasingly concerned about this, about having this piecemeal regulation. However, most of the big tech companies, I think all of the most valuable American tech companies are in California and Washington. So if these states pass these laws, I think regulators are certainly looking at that as an opportunity to control these companies beyond their borders.
Well, then of course there's this wrinkle that so many of them now are lobbying for a federal regulation that conveniently would likely override state regulation and make compliance voluntary.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to see what happens with these tech
My
companies.
favorite kind of law.
They're so against something until something scarier comes along, which is what happened in California. There was a ballot initiative that would have enacted privacy regulations that tech companies were freaking out about. They were not happy. And so they ended up kind of begrudgingly accepting this last-minute legislative effort. The California legislature passed a law because they wanted to do something that companies were a little more comfortable with than letting voters decide. But it's funny, it's all relative in regulation.
I mean, there is the argument that this is the business model of the web, right? And the argument that we consumers benefit in ways mostly related to advertising. But we do get, we get free services, that there's convenience, that there might be safety, economies of scale. What do you say to that? Like, what's the argument that says we don't need any regulation, the public pressure is enough, these companies will self-regulate?
Well, I think the argument is the last 2 years. I think, it is a fair point to bring up, though. Most of us do use these services and get value out of them. And the consequences have not yet been so extreme that they've encouraged us not to use these services anymore. I think that's starting to change because most people, in my experience, while it's creepy when an ad follows you around the internet, it's not enough to stop wanting to get pictures of your sister's kid or connect with a group of high school friends on Facebook. But I think what does prompt a more emotional response is learning that political operatives are using your information to achieve a specific outcome, or learning that you've been scammed or robbed online, or having children. My generation is starting to have children, and these services that we thought were so fun and whatever, who cares for us, I have had so many conversations with people who think, well, I don't want to create this digital footprint for somebody who I care more about than myself. These questions are starting to come up, and I think it's going to have a huge impact. It already is.
Yeah. What do you think are the next steps? We were sort of waiting for some federal regulation to potentially be proposed. We got net neutrality first, which I didn't see coming. What do you think comes next in that conversation about regulation?
I think it is going to continue to move forward in the states. The states are sort of a laboratory for legislation and for democracy. But I think eventually it's going to get to a point where companies, like we talked about, start lobbying for something federal just so that they don't have to deal with the compliance nightmare of different laws and controls in every single state. Or it's going to be a situation where whoever has the strongest laws, if it's a state as powerful as California or Washington, will sort of set the tone for how these companies behave everywhere. But I do think that we're just getting started, and it doesn't seem like, to me, there is an end game in this that allows these services to continue operating the way that they are.
What do you hear when you talk to companies? Like, what are they telling you about their practices? Like, certainly GDPR, I think, has forced a lot of change on people. There is consumer awareness. Actually, you know what? I'm going to ask a different version of that. What are you hearing from consumers? Because I still feel like, this room aside, a lot of people just don't care. They don't see this harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, there are their feelings and there's their behavior. We also have this conversation a lot with journalism where you hear people talk about the news and how important it is to protect this institution. And my first question is always, do you subscribe to a newspaper? And it's kind of the same with privacy. It's not important enough yet to enough people, but this conversation is just getting started. And I think the fact that this is a full room and that we are having this conversation is becoming one of the key issues of the 2020 election after just a year since the real, sort of Fukushima moment with Cambridge Analytica shows that it's an important debate that's accelerating.
And then let's talk about antitrust briefly, because I feel like that's such a fascinating conversation. Like, we wouldn't be having this conversation if the scale were not so great, right? If these companies were not so big and the reach were not so far and two of them didn't control 70 to 80% of the digital ad market. What does that start to look like? Do you think that these conversations about antitrust and breakups are actually, I mean, I know we're in Seattle and this has kind of happened here before, but do you think these are real conversations?
Well, I think the proposal that Senator Warren came out with was intentionally radical because there's the sort of the policy objective and then there's the debate objective. And I think more than anything, it's forcing us to have this conversation. But I think there is going to need to be a little bit of a reevaluating of how we think about antitrust. Amazon is a great example. I'm not saying that they are in violation of any antitrust laws, but historically, the way that we've thought about antitrust is big companies using their power to gain a competitive advantage and raise prices. Amazon uses their power to gain a competitive advantage and lower prices. So how do we define antitrust then under those terms? It's a less clear cut. Amazon is also gobbling up huge troves of data. They're not sharing it. They're using it.
Yeah.
And they're using it very effectively. Is that as much of a concern as companies like Facebook that are gathering our data and sharing them with third parties? I don't know. I think it's an important question to ask, though.
Right. Well, because fundamentally it gets to this question of harm. Again, there's a harm standard in antitrust statute. There's a harm question around privacy. Like, what does it hurt if someone has my information? And it still feels, I don't know, it still feels hard to define. I'm doing this on purpose, you guys.
Well, do you feel like beyond it being creepy, it's hurt you?
Well, I mean, don't ask me. I'm deliberately playing devil's advocate
Okay.
here. Yeah. I mean, I think, any of you read it? You probably haven't read it because it's 2 million pages long, but Shoshana Zuboff's new book called Surveillance Capitalism. Started it, yeah. It takes a minute, I'm not gonna lie. But what she argues, and we had her on the podcast recently, and she does this really deliberate walkthrough of the journey from data collection to behavioral manipulation. And that's where we get to when we talk about Facebook embedding in political candidates and saying, we can totally change someone's vote. And Cambridge Analytica saying, yeah, that's why we used it. And then Facebook saying, well, we can't change someone's vote. That's absurd. So yeah, I think we're walking that line of it's hard to prove.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the harm beyond an individual basis of how it personally affects me, I feel like the questions to be asking about is about the systemic harm of creating a reality where there's one or two sort of people who own the roads where all information travels through, and where the information you receive is so selective and based on a network that you've cultivated, where people are no longer exposed to new ideas. Those echo chambers and the impact that they're having on our democracy and our sort of collective political thought, I think, is a more interesting and scary conversation when we get into harms than the conversation about an individual's like trade-off for their data versus what they're getting.
Yep. All right, I'm going to let you off the hook. We're going to bring out our next panelist, Gary Srinivas. While he makes his way to the stage, we have another surprising fact for you. Uber once conducted research to determine whether people were more or less likely to call an Uber when their battery was dying on their phone. It may not surprise you to know they definitely called an Uber. Gary Srinivas is CEO of Helm, which is a company that, as I understand it, lets you take your information out of someone else's cloud and put it on your own and control it. Tell us what you're doing at Helm.
Yeah, so...
And welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so we have a core belief that individuals should have an easy way to own and control their personal information. And so what we've developed is actually a personal server that goes in your home and starts to replace cloud-based services that you depend on today. So the first thing that we've gotten started with is email. So instead of having your email with a company like Google, for example, you can actually have a Helm personal server in your home on a domain of your choosing, and it works just pretty much like any other email service you'd use today.
I love this because this is like what me and all my nerd friends used to do until we thought, oh, a fire is going to come. We should put our stuff in the cloud. How are we coming back now?
Yeah, well, so what's interesting, right, is that you can actually combine, some of the things that the cloud can offer you with some of the, really great innovations that have occurred because of smartphones, interestingly, that have really miniaturized computing to develop a personal server that can go in your home at a pretty decent price, but still have things like, the reliability and continuity of service that you'd expect from the cloud today. So there's a lot of things that have changed. I'm one of those people, 15 years ago or 16 years ago now, I set up my first email server for myself. And, my co-founder was the same way. And we thought, what we do is actually a labor of love. It takes a lot of time and effort to just do it for yourself. Consumers don't really have an alternative. And even, in your presentation and your conversation earlier, I think one of the things that's missing right now is consumers are looking for alternatives, right? They're looking out and they're saying, well, Google provides these services to me, or Facebook provides these services to me. And not just Helm, there are lots of other startups and lots of other companies now that are trying to develop alternatives so that consumers can have more control and can have more ownership and to fundamentally change the economics around this data economy.
Right. So if we were going to talk about a market-based solution before regulation comes in, can privacy be a selling point?
Well, I think it is. It's already become a selling point. Just today, Apple launched a new advertising campaign around their smartphone, and the number one message for that is around privacy. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a minute-long clip. You can check it out later. But if a company like that is going to put that front and center, and you can argue it's to their benefit, right, to do this because of the way they develop their products. We're now seeing Facebook is making, trying to pivot their entire company around privacy. You could argue that's to head off some of the regulation that's coming their way. But I think it is becoming clear that there is a value that consumers are either having today or going to have in the future for products, and the decisions that they're going to make about the products that they're going to use. So absolutely.
What does the bar become if you promise that privacy? Like if you're Apple and you're promising privacy as a selling point, but my phone still runs on Verizon, which is gathering information about everywhere I go on my iPhone. I feel like we're at trust apocalypse right now when it comes to consumers and companies. And so that even if some parts of this conversation feel unfair to technologists or business people or venture capitalists, that it feels like there's a whole bunch of people who don't care at all, and then there's a whole bunch of people who just aren't going to believe you.
Yeah, I think so. The contrast between what Apple can do for you versus what Verizon doesn't do for you, the danger of that is you go down the slippery slope towards privacy nihilism or security nihilism. And I think it's important that people recognize that they can take steps that matter. And it's going to be a combination of what the market can provide in terms of solutions, but also what the regulatory frameworks can provide. Mm-hmm. I think the combination of those two things are going to drive a healthy environment for consumers to have their data and have ownership and control and know exactly what's going on. I mean, I think with Cambridge Analytica wouldn't have been as big of a deal as it is now if we didn't have the Snowden revelations back in 2013.
Right.
That is what I think really set the tone for how people are appreciating what's going on with Cambridge Analytica. The Snowden revelations were much more personalized, right? The government having access to my data, like what does that mean for me? Cambridge Analytica showed us that there's an existential threat that comes to our, our very way of life by these huge companies having access to this information in a way that can be manipulated. So I think it's a combination of what the regulatory frameworks will do to, kind of paint some boundaries for these companies, but also what the market will offer for these customers.
Yeah, I think you need both, right? Because you need to have an option for people who are like deeply immersed in these issues and concerned about them, and it's worth paying a premium. But you don't want to create a situation where privacy is just something for those who can afford it. So
Yep.
I think the regulatory piece helps with those who are still going to use free services because they cannot reasonably afford to pay for something, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed the same basic rights that we've decided as a society that you should have.
Right. It's the I should get to have it all.
Yeah.
That's what I want in 2020. I want to have it all. I want to know who got fat from high school, and I still want to control my data. I'm going to stop saying that. That's not very nice. How do you, I mean, you're starting a company, you're in startup land, I assume.
Yeah.
How do you see the competitive landscape when you look at trying to make this argument, which is like, put this server in your house? It's non-trivial.
Yeah. Yeah, so we started thinking about this idea actually back in 2013. It was after the Snowden revelations that we started, thinking about this idea and thinking about how each of us were able to do this because we had the time, we had the know-how, we had the interest. We waited basically a couple of years to see what the market would come up with. And we didn't really see that much that was compelling or interesting that was changing. There was a little bit of governmental reforms, but not anything significant. So we've actually been at work on Helm for about 3 years now. And like any sort of movement, it starts off with people who have some insight into what making a change would mean for them and for others. And I think about this kind of in the vein of conscious consumerism, right? You had people who decided that they wanted to eat clean or eat organic early. The first people who showed up at a Whole Foods, for example, right? Or the people who went out and bought the Tesla Roadster. Not necessarily because they wanted like a small, fast car, but because they believed in the future of electric vehicles and what that would do for the environment. Mm-hmm. I think privacy is kind of going through a very similar motion right now, where you have people who work in tech, who work in IT, and even people who work in marketing, who have been buying these ads, who are coming back and saying, I know what's going on like behind the scenes, and we can be doing it differently. We should be doing it differently. And I'm going to make choices on the products and services that I use as a result of that.
Yeah. What do you see? We asked this question, or we chatted about this a little in email. Right now, this is the dominant business model for web services. Yeah. What do you think? What else could it be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I would like to see is targeted advertising outlawed, right? I think that targeted advertising is kind of the root of what causes this problem. I've been on the internet since the mid-90s,
yeah.
Right? And so it's not like ads are a recent phenomenon. We've had ads for a long time. It's the specific targeting on very, very detailed information about individuals that has kind of taken this to the nth degree. So I think that we will need to continue to have an ad-supported model for the internet, but I think taking out that degree of targeting will fundamentally change how much information we actually have out there and how that information can be abused. I also think that there's a very interesting model which we're interested in longer term. So, with the idea of putting servers into people's homes and having people actually own and control data in their homes, we'd like to see companies bring their applications and services to the consumer. Mm-hmm. Right now, you actually go to these websites, you give them all of your data, and now more and more people are learning that that's not necessarily a fair trade. I think it's a fundamentally different and sort of more decentralized model where you can actually invite a company to provide an application or service on a server like this and decide what it is you want to share with them or not. And that's a longer term part of our vision that we're building toward. In the beginning, we're going to provide those core applications and services, but we'd like to see that model kind of shift on its head a bit.
Not for nothing, Tim Berners-Lee is attempting a similar
Yeah.
kind of platform, so good idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to get our next panelist up here immediately because I want to ask him if he thinks that we should outlaw targeted advertising. Ryan Kalo, professor at UW, right around the corner, and co-founder of the Tech Policy Lab. Welcome. No fun fact for you. Sorry.
Good.
Okay, we'll negotiate the chair first. I don't want to distract you. Okay. So we have this provocative question before the panel. Do you think that the solution here to solving this business problem is to outlaw targeted advertising?
Gosh, so I think that if you wind up outlawing targeted advertising, you are essentially outlawing online advertising. The reason being that even today, as we talk about how much advertising is happening online and how much we are using data in it, still the vast majority of ad spend is not online, right? It's still it's on TV, it's on billboards, it's on this kind of thing, right? The value add of online advertising is the ability to target very closely. And that's how they go around competing against billboards or against other kinds of media. Now, whether we should outlaw online advertising is a different question that I have a different answer to. But I think that if you just take away the targeting, the business model doesn't work.
I feel like we could have a long conversation about retargeting, but that would just get us down a rabbit hole. What in your view, as somebody who's been working on these issues for a lot of years, what in your view, if anything, has changed since Cambridge Analytica, since those revelations?
Well, I mean, I think that the public awareness, as we've already talked about, has changed substantially since Cambridge Analytica. It's sort of like I've been thinking for a long time, when is privacy going to get its whale song? And what I mean by that is that there were all these fights to combat whaling, and that internationally, and they never really had much traction until somebody all of a sudden dropped a mic very far below and started to record those sperm whale songs, and they played these before the UN. And when you hear these beautiful, eerie, complex whale songs, all of a sudden people go, oh gosh, I get it. We shouldn't be hunting these animals in the way that we're doing, right? What's going to be the thing that gives us traction? Cambridge Analytica and the Snowden revelations, played that role. I'll tell you, having studied privacy for some time now, one of the major shifts over the period of time I've been studying it, first in the academy, but now in the mainstream conversation, has been that privacy has shifted from a conversation about whether you have control over your personal information to how you can be controlled by other people that have your personal information. That is a deep shift, and that is precisely, I think, what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, and that gets this question of harm, which I know you said you have a very specific answer to. How do we assess that, and how do we make that clear to people?
So I have two observations about harm. The first is that I have very specific theories about what constitutes privacy harm. For me, it has two components. The first is subjective. That is the idea that just by virtue of understanding that companies and governments are watching you and are recording what you do, and by the way, when you perceive that you are being retargeted, you are being targeted on the basis of something about you, it causes a psychological harm. It's a subjective harm. It's a feeling of unease, of constantly being observed. It's led to this interesting phenomenon that I think you guys have talked about on Marketplace Tech before, which is that folks don't know whether or not the ad that they saw was coincidence or was because they were talking in a coffee shop about books, and all of a sudden they get a, what I mean? And
yeah.
it may not be. That is to say, it might have nothing to do with your conversation, but the fact that you feel that way all the time, right? And so, in the law, and I'm a law professor, I should be clear, we have for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, compensated subjective harms like this. So for example, we compensate assault, which in tort law, not criminal law, means creating an imminent apprehension of physical harm. It's the idea that someone would run at you with a bat, they don't actually hit you, but they've created this fear in you, that's compensable. The other aspect of harm is the one that we've mostly been dwelling on so far in this conversation, which is the idea that you would actually be objectively and materially harmed. For example, because of what a company knows about you, you wind up paying more for a product or for insurance. This is actually hurting you in your pocketbook. The second observation I want to make about harm quickly is that it's very strange the way that the courts have been so suspicious of privacy harm, and how so many class action lawsuits and so many statutory claims wind up not working out because courts say, I don't get what the harm is. Now that's pretty anomalous because, as I said, we've been recognizing subjective harms for a long time. Harms to your reputation, making you feel afraid. Statutory harms like copyright violations that are not necessarily pegged to any particular showing of harm. So it's both. So for me, idiosyncratically, it has this dimension of being psychological and material, and then furthermore, it's exceptional among the courts because they seem not to recognize it when they recognize some other things.
You're saying they don't seem to care, and that's weird.
They don't seem to care, and it's weird.
Yeah.
Especially because they care about other, ethereal, torts. Like they care about other instances where you're harmed in a way that is not, is so obviously concrete, but somehow with privacy, it doesn't ever gain traction.
What can we do moving forward? We are having this conversation. It feels like the conversation is gaining traction, and I'm sure, I know that I know from conversations with people at these companies that there's this sense that they don't understand what happened. They don't understand why everyone is so angry, and it tells you a lot about what fairness as a concept can do to people, and how upset they can get. But what lessons can we draw from this as we move into, because this extraction shows no sign of letting up, and in fact, huge parts of the digital economy are predicated on it as we move toward artificial intelligence. So now what?
Now what? I mean, it's...
You're a lawyer, man. How come you can't help us?
I'm going to solve it. After what I say right now, we can end the panel, and then we can move on. So first of all, you had raised, Molly, this provocative idea of, hey, maybe you should get paid for your data, right? And this is something that I've heard, Jared Lanier and many other people have argued for. I'm not a fan of that approach, and I'll explain why. Do you remember this, I think maybe it's possibly a slightly offensive term, but you remember this idea that sailors in San Francisco would get too drunk and then they'd wake up and they'd be on a ship? You know what I mean? And they were Shanghai. This idea that you wake up, all of a sudden you're in the service of this thing. Again, not a great term, but the idea basically is that you wake up in the service of somebody, and those folks, those sailors that woke up on those ships, they were paid. You know what I mean? And if we start paying people for the awful arrangement that they're in, it's a little bit like that in my mind. It's like we all got drunk on data, we woke up and all of a sudden we're getting a little bit of money for it. You know what I mean? No thank you. So my view is that it's much simpler, right? It's much simpler. The idea is that, you pay for things that are valuable. And I have long been a proponent of the idea of the WhatsApp model before it was purchased, where you pay a couple dollars a year and you get this service in exchange for it. And yes, there will be people that can't afford it, and we should subsidize it for those people. We should try to keep it affordable, absolutely, right? In fact, maybe even there could be a version of it that is well regulated for people who can't pay anything. But for everybody else, the idea is you pay for stuff. That's the history of the world for hundreds of years. If you want some people to do something for you, you pay for it. And so that to me is the radical / extremely simple solution to all of this problem.
Just pay for stuff. This seems like a great part to, I know, right? Breaking it down. This seems like a great moment to open it up to, let's talk amongst ourselves about this idea, because I want to hear your thoughts on, should we get paid or should we pay? You've given us, what do you think hearing Ryan's argument?
Well, I mean, I love how willing everyone here is to pay. Stop taking my information. I think that equity concerns are real and they're valid because it's not just a few dollars a year. It's also, it's having the access to these tools to be able to use these services. And when I think about the future of the economy, there's already a really wide digital divide, and the people who have access to these tools from a young age, who are learning how they work, learning how to write the back end of how they work, they are going to be lined up for better jobs in the future. So there's all these sort of externalities. But I think paying is one model. I think that regulators need to not just catch up to the current moment, but be looking ahead at where we're going with facial recognition and artificial intelligence, because it is only going to get more complicated. And I think journalists have a huge role to play. We know about Cambridge Analytica because of journalists, because reporters expose this information. And this is, no bias at all as a tech journalist, but one of the challenges of these stories is they're very, very complicated, and it's hard to understand why I, as an individual person, am impacted by this. And I think, like the New York Times reporters who exposed the Cambridge Analytica story in partnership with European reporters did show you how it relates to you. They showed you the election and the current political moment, and I think that plays a huge role as well. Being watchdogs to these companies. I've heard tech is the new politics.
Yeah, the news cycle feels similar once in a while. Gary, what do you think?
So, I mean, obviously starting a business in this space, I think people should be paying for it, right? I mean, it's like I'm very biased in this way, but I will say,
We're
like,
all biased up here.
yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize, like, there are a variety of business models that are on the table. It's not uncommon for, like, there's a freemium business model, right, where you've got paying subscribers or paying users of a service that subsidize free users, right? And I think what we've seen is that this has been taken to the nth degree, where companies are taking a look at not just their paid users, but their free users and figuring out how can we extract more and more value from them. And that's why we see the data being used the way that it's being used right now. And this is where I think regulation can play a really important role. It is about equity. It's about knowing that the way that data gets used actually ends up harming minorities more, for example, right? So, when you came out, Ryan, you said, maybe I'll start the first sort of disagreement, right? Which is you came out and said, hey, I don't think that banning or outlawing targeted advertising is a sustainable business model. And I think we've seen, if you go back and look at the history of these companies like Google, for example, you've seen that they've gotten progressively more targeted in their advertising to extract more and more value out of the users of their services. And it's possible for us to dial that back. We have to demand it. We have to demand our legislators actually go and put together a framework by which we can dial it back and say, we don't want advertising to be this targeted, because we are starting to appreciate the consequences of that. Because we're going to have more Cambridge Analyticas, right? And we're going to have things like we saw with Snowden with other governments around the world too. So I think, we as citizens of the country, we have a responsibility in kind of demanding what it is that we want. But the first part of it is figuring out what is it exactly that we do want. There will be room for people to get paid for data that they provide. My biggest concern is that if that doesn't have kind of appropriate bounds on it, you end up with exactly what you described, which is a very dangerous future for us, right? Where people get drunk on data and they're like, what happened? Where am I now?
So they get a couple $100, but it doesn't get any.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
But they still get manipulated out of their vote.
They get manipulated out of their vote, and it's very asymmetric. The value that the company gets from that data versus what you get in your pocket. And I think, Ryan, you touched on something that I think is really important, which is the psychological harms of this. I mean, I like to think about it as a chilling effect. When you know you're being watched, your behavior changes pretty dramatically. Shortly after the Snowden revelations, Wikipedia released some data about how searches for terrorism had basically just fallen off of a cliff. People were not interested in learning about terrorist incidents around the world because they were worried that their behavior was going to be tracked. I don't think this is a good or healthy thing for a society where we need to have comfort in the free exchange of ideas, and we can't have that if we feel like we're being watched.
I think this is a place, though, to point out that the effect has not been that chilling on these companies, right? That Facebook is still reporting that user growth might be somewhat flat in the United States, but it's growing leaps and bounds all over the country, and that really still a large percentage of people don't care. They sincerely don't care. They don't see it. And so while we're having this conversation in this bubble, how much do we have to consider the possibility that it's not going to go that far? Just trying to be a little bit of a bummer for a second.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say that people do all kinds of stuff that's bad for them.
Right.
you know?
So we have to help them help themselves.
And we regulate it. You know what I
Yes.
mean? It's just like people do all kinds of stuff that's bad for them.
Yep.
And I mean, and on the point about online advertising and targeting, I do want to draw a distinction. I think is appropriate because it's almost excavating a distinction that once was very obvious but has gone away, which is there's a few different ways to target ads online. One of them is just about being contextual, right? You are reading an article about soccer and you're sold soccer balls. That is a very different thing from following you around and supplementing that data from a third party and getting the data from here and building this psychological profile of you and then serving you the ad that not only is of interest to you, but it's actually served in such a way that it's going to be the most attractive to you. So for example, I've seen research showing that you can have the same ad, but you can couch it differently depending on what you understand about a person's psychology. So for example, let's say that for whatever reason, Monica's like, well, all she cares about is what's popular. She's really, she's just like really into popularity.
Not your vibe, by the way.
Exactly. But not exactly, not your vibe, which is why it's funny. But the idea is like you care about what's really popular, and so when you get this advertisement, what you see in the advertisement is it says our most popular item. And you're like, oh, I'll take that. That's our most popular item, right? But for some reason, the way that I grew up, what I really care about is I'm really worried about scarcity. You know what I mean? I just grew up in an environment where I don't care. I buck the system. I don't care what everybody else thinks. But I really worry about scarcity. And that same product is sold to me, and it says while supplies last, right? I've seen research suggesting that that's effective. Right? So there's a huge delta between just showing you ads because you happen to, I know you like soccer because you watch the soccer, versus this profiling, right? I will say though that especially when you get into the political realm, there is a very unfortunate elephant in the room at one level, which is the First Amendment. So if you begin to aggressively assert a prohibition on online advertising, you will get massive pushback under the First Amendment. It'll be like this. Imagine that a person who's running for Congress has a room like this in front of her, and she walks around talking to various people, and she tries to get the sense of what the sentiments are. You know what I mean? And so she just hears from you, and these are your concerns, and blah, blah, blah. And she comes up and sits up here, and then she tells a story that seems to resonate with the people that she talked to. And you tell her, you can't do that. You can't select your message on the basis of talking to people about what their interests are, right? No way that flies in our system. So what's the distinction between that and following people online and tailoring your message on the basis of? That's the kind of argument you're going to get from people who weaponize the First Amendment. So I mean, I think that it's very fraught to try to ban a category of speech, whereas it's much simpler to promote the paid option, which I think actually finally would take off.
I mean, when we're talking about politics and kind of the global impact of these companies, I think probably most people in the business community would say that the reason that America has all of the biggest, most valuable tech companies is because they're in America, because the climate here has created them. But when you think about them expanding out into the global economy, there's a difference in value between what a middle-class American trades off in terms of their data for what they get from Facebook, and maybe they have the luxury of looking at privacy as more of a concern, than in the developing world where you might be a small business owner and have absolutely no infrastructure to set up your own website or online payment system. And Facebook is offering all of these things, which in that case, maybe privacy feels like a fair trade-off. So as these companies expand out into the world, I mean, on the one hand, you want to think about, do we want to create a regulatory environment that discourages the next Google? On the other hand, do we have an opportunity in the US, because we contain all of these companies, to create rules of the road that are really fair in countries where the consumers might not have as much say in advocating for what they really need?
Mm-hmm. So one sort of thing I'll riff off on that is another way to look at this is what's going on in China, right? So you have the rapid creation of extremely large, extremely valuable internet companies that have a very friendly relationship with the government, and are almost regulated effectively regulated to have a friendly relationship with the government. And in the United States right now, it's very interesting. I keep coming back to the Snowden revelations, but this happened under Obama's watch, right? And people of a particular political persuasion were like, hey, it's fine because we like the guy who's in charge. And now we've got a completely different type of president in charge, right? And we don't really know what the future portends, like exactly where we're gonna end up politically. I think we all are hoping for things to be better, whatever you want to be better. But I think we run into this situation where, as we allow these companies to collect this information for the purposes of better targeting, we run into the situation where companies holding that data is actually more of a liability than an asset. Mm-hmm. It's a liability for the company because they have a bigger and bigger target on their back for breaches. That's why we ended up with something like Equifax, right? And it's a liability for citizens because if somebody comes to the head of a government and has a very strong hand in that government, they can abuse that data. So I think that there is the argument for what are small businesses and even citizens getting out of these services for free, but we believe that there's a long-term liability with the massive collection of this data over time. So I think I'm in violent agreement with you that there's a distinction between advertising based on context and interest. If you're on a soccer website, hey, advertise jerseys and soccer balls and all that stuff, that makes a ton of sense. But if you're building very rich, detailed profiles with the intent of manipulating individuals, that's the thing that I have an issue with. And I think that there is a place for regulation around that.
I mean, what's interesting about this is that Google CEO Sundar Pichai sat in front of Congress and essentially said, we don't need actually that much data to advertise to effectively. And yet we have this machine. And yet we have this liability. And yet we have, so is there a middle ground that says minimum viable data? That just says, we just need this much to serve you this ad in the moment. It doesn't have to go any further than that. And we're not going to save it. Is some of this just philosophical and cultural? I mean,
that's how we run our business.
Right.
That's exactly how we run our business. We make it very clear to all of our customers, we want to know as little about you as possible.
Yeah.
And I think it would be very interesting to see, someone like Google, like Sundar Pichai saying that in his testimony, and then you could just go to Google's products, not just for consumers, but go look at the advertising products. I don't believe that that their actions match their words in that regard. I don't think it's consistent at all.
I mean, if you want to get really philosophical, we can talk about how valuable we want these companies to be, because it's not like there wasn't a model for online advertising before this really sophisticated micro-targeting, but that has allowed these companies to become worth so much money. And there's certainly a case they shouldn't have that much money, but think about a city like Seattle, which now has an extra, 500,000 jobs, 50,000 jobs from Amazon, 600,000 worldwide. I mean, those are good paying jobs. The tech economy is really driving the American economy. So I think that you could make a case either way, but if you're talking about philosophy, it's kind of like, do we want to keep fueling this engine, or do we want to rein it back in and try to redistribute our economy in a way that allows for more people to play?
I worry a little bit.
You want to go all the way to capitalism? Because we can do it.
Yeah, well, I mean,
got all night.
I worry a little bit, though, that it shouldn't, I don't think that we should paint this as, the growth of the U.S. economy driven by tech has got to be based on ads or nothing, right? I think that it's possible for a company like Google to be very big and a company like Facebook to be very big and other upstarts, hopefully ours, to also become very big by having different types of business models, different ways to offer value to people that doesn't effectively rely right now on their ignorance. Right? I mean, if you really take a step back, I mean, you're presenting this in the beginning of your presentation, right? They're banking on people's ignorance, and now the veil is being pulled back, and we're going to see what comes of it. But that's how they've gotten to this position so far.
Mm-hmm. Senator, we ran ads. We actually don't have all night, so what I'd like to do is take your pulse one more time. We're going to ask you that same poll question that we asked in the beginning, which was already this is what you said last time. So have we convinced any outliers, is my question. Do you think that you are getting a fair trade for your data? Once again, I will assure you we are not collecting your phone numbers when you text us.
You're not.
I'm not. Somebody might be. I haven't open sourced this software, that's true. I guess I can't.
It's gotten more dramatic.
It's gotten even more dramatic.
Yeah.
This means I failed at playing devil's advocate. I
There's
tried.
a right answer.
I tried. What I would like to do now, actually, is open it up for questions from the audience. I think that there is a microphone. Do you want people to come to the aisles? Yeah, if you can come to the center aisle if you have a question and line up there. Look at it, they're jumping up. This is so exciting. We've allotted plenty of time for audience Q&A. It's not one of those like 2-minute things.
Do I start? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I know that there's a tendency to sort of poo-poo this idea about paying for something, but I think there is a model that, and certainly we've seen this with Amazon, where people are willing to pay for something. So I am completely addicted to Prime because I get free shipping, and so I've stopped buying anything from anybody except Amazon, and I pay them a lot of money every year to feed my addiction to their free shipping. So it's really, a lot of it is how you put it together. I've paid for free email even because I didn't want to get ads, and I think I would make the argument that people would consider paying $20 a year for Facebook if they knew that their data was not being sold, or that they would pay that for their kids so that their data was not being collected and sold. And that is how you get paid for data. You get it for free if you don't get your data collected. So is there,
Yeah.
I mean, I just think that we need to think a little bit more broadly about this pay, not pay. I think there's something there. But I just am curious. I know, Monica, this must be a terrible idea to you, but I'm just curious about, can we start to look at a model where people pay a little extra to not have their data shared? And I'm
This
interested
is
in what you think.
obviously, this is a biased audience, but let's do a quick poll in here. How many of you would be willing to pay for Google for searches?
Just for searches or for all Google?
How many of you would pay for a search? I mean, that's a lot of good data. Okay. Maybe about a third. I'm going to pay per search. Okay. So maybe I'm going to say a third. Who would pay for all Google services if those were bundled like Office 365?
Well, so
I feel like
we
we just gave them an idea, but we're still only at a little over half.
But just to be clear,
which I think is
what you're
telling.
saying is, who would pay for those services in exchange for not having Google
Right.
use their data
Yep.
for? Okay, that's what people are going to pay for.
And then now here's what I want to know. Would you pay for Google and Facebook and Office 365 and maybe Twitter and Amazon Prime? So I think, what do you think? What do you think about this little thought experiment?
I mean, I think it was very, very clear is that Google should do periodic pledge drives.
If you go home with one thing today.
That's
Try
true.
to search for
That
something,
ish
and then,
works. It works.
I think it's clear that like people are realizing there's no such thing as a free service.
Yeah, definitely.
Free services are not actually free.
I think there are a lot of people who would pay, and I think there needs to be I mean, it's absurd for Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg to say you don't want to pay, right? You'd rather not pay. You'd rather just have the fun ads and what have you. But I think there are really real questions about equity, and we are already getting to a point. I mean, we face this question in media all the time. We're already getting to a point where there's an argument to be made that people can buy their way into better quality information.
And better schools.
And I mean, well, yeah, right? Yeah. But that we could reach a point where misinformation and propaganda are perpetrated upon the poor and the elderly. And we are getting to that point already when information is unreachable to people, and when basic services like email are unreachable to people because they can't afford it, then you take the inequality that we already have and you make it really serious.
Yeah, and I mean,
why I wanna
that's
have it
my
all.
concern too. And with I agree that there should be a premium lane maybe, but there are so many of these services, and increasingly you need to know how to navigate all of them to participate in the modern economy.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's already a huge challenge. There are huge parts of the country that don't even have access to good broadband. And we're seeing some of the sort of political externalities of that divide play out. And if we create a situation where you have to have enough money to participate in the digital world, then I just only see that widening.
Right. Well, and we won't go too much farther into this because there's a long line there, but there's also the question of data brokers. So even if I paid to opt out of Facebook collecting my data, there's a shadowy industry of thousands of companies who are buying and selling it every day that I don't even know about. All right, next.
Okay, I could make an argument that China is going to develop tools that are going to make all the tools you're talking about here feel just trivial. So could you comment on the possibility of China being able to access the standard database, which is available for all of us, and make the stuff that Russia did in the last election look like a trivial exercise?
Yeah. Well, we know that China's already using personal data to absolutely perpetrate mass behavioral experiment. I mean, they're using the social scores to essentially manipulate people socially. There's
Black Mirror episode.
It's right. Like China right now is the Black Mirror version of where data collection goes. But what do you think about this question of then hacking? Sort of then when the data liability question. Just bad, right?
Well, I mean, look, I've had occasion over the past couple of years to sit down and interview the director of the CIA, Director Brennan, and later on Admiral Rogers, who's the head of the NSA. And to each of them, I posed a question about this, this concern about the Chinese or obviously the Russians, Iranians, whoever it happened to be. How do you solve this problem of them attacking our democracy? And the response I keep getting is you make it really painful. You make it not worth their while. You know what I mean? They do it, you do it to them, you bring sanctions, you whatever it happens to be. That there isn't some technical magical fix, like unlike what Mark Zuckerberg told Congress, you can't use AI to fix it. You know what I mean? And so, in fact, I remember it's like growing up, like there's like I always used to hear from people like how don't worry, the market will fix it. You know what I mean? I feel like AI is the market will fix it. Like AI will fix it.
AI can't fix everything.
It will fix
AI
everything, right? Yeah. And so at the end of the day, like I'm sorry, like I'm playing this sort of role of a sort of a curmudgeonly. I remember when but I mean I feel like with a lot of statecraft, the issue is if someone's doing something wrong to you, you make it not worth their while. And so and this whole idea about how Facebook's somehow going to fix this problem just isn't right. You know what I mean? And so I worry about what China can do. I worry about what they can do with their conventional nuclear weapons. I worry about what they can do with their economic cloud. I worry about what they can do. You know what I mean? It's like I worry about a lot of things that other rival nations can do. And you need statecraft, which is, I would argue, sorely lacking at the precise moment to deal with some of these problems. Yeah.
Right now, they don't need our data. They have all billion.
Also their own,
I mean, really.
That's what I was going to say. I think there's actually two issues at play here, right? One is we are effectively in an arms race on AI, right?
Yes.
I think that's very evident that Chinese companies, with the way that they develop their platforms, the way in which Chinese citizens live their lives in products like WeChat, where everything that they do online goes on in a platform, and the visibility that they get into that, they have access to a tremendous amount of data and a very large population to get that data. In the U.S., we're running into issues, right? We're running into issues now with what regulation is going to do. But there's this question of, how good can AI get, if you feed it enough data? Mm-hmm. I'm in the camp. I'm kind of more in the Apple camp. I'd like to see more localized learning. Do it on the device. Don't do it across these huge data sets. I think there's a lot that we can do there. But so there's the AI arms race, and then I think the separate issue is what politicians call like the cyber, right? So cyber attacks going back and forth, and I think that there's just information asymmetry, right? So we as citizens hear quite a bit about what foreign governments are perpetrating on us. We don't hear a lot about what what the NSA and what our forces are doing overseas. The rhetoric is escalating, right? And it's not clear that we've made it painful enough for them, for our overseas adversaries to stop, right? I mean, I think that there have been some point incidents like North Korea and Sony, right, where there have been some reactive measures. Mm-hmm. but it's the wild, wild west. Microsoft is one of the companies that's trying to push for, hey, let's provide the Geneva Accord for how we do cyber warfare.
Yeah.
Right? It's just very undefined right now, and as a result, I think it's going to be pretty messy. It's going to be very messy.
Thank you.
Making our way through our line.
Hi, I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone, hi Professor, for all of their time and great contributions. I also just wanted to point out really quickly that nuclear weapons are conventional now, I guess. I don't know.
Analog.
In the world of cyber. My question was something that actually wasn't brought up so far, and I just wanted to hear everyone's thoughts on whether granular data, like how much I spent on, I don't know, health products this past month or something, whether that granular data has inherent value or whether the value of data comes from aggregation. And in that sense, do these big tech companies actually derive value from their own efforts rather than from our data that they collect? Thank you.
That's a great question.
He should have been on the panel.
I know. Come on up. I like your scarf. Come on. What do you think? I mean, I think that we, just as a starting place, all thought that this was aggregate data, right? Isn't that what when we first didn't care about our data being collected, we said, well, it's just going into a database of, other ladies who are about 5'11" and can't seem to hit 6 feet and like these shoes and, this and that. And that wasn't that big a deal. It didn't stress me out because it wasn't so personal.
Yeah, I think when we start to talk about profiling, granular data is incredibly useful because it doesn't just tell the company the type of person you are. It tells the company the type of thing you're interested in within a 6-week period. That's hugely valuable if you're trying to sell that person something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say correlation is what matters in many ways more than aggregation. If I can correlate one small bit of data here with another bit of data here in your identity and triangulate that in an interesting way, I can learn quite a bit about you, particularly if I see that triangulation effective with certain advertising schemes or manipulation schemes elsewhere. So aggregation matters, but I think correlation at the end of the day is where it can get really painful.
And that's what we're seeing in location tracking too, right? Did this just turn on?
Got a little louder.
Well, with some of the stories that have been coming out about companies that track your location, that is really granular, and the reporters who investigated it were able to target specific people and see where they moved throughout the day. And if a company can do that and see, you walk by a Starbucks 3 times a day, that is also valuable, and it's extremely granular.
Well, I want to say 2 things. One is that at the University of Washington, we have excellent students like Leron. And if you're in a position to hire one of them, particularly one who is getting a JD but has a PhD in material science coming into us, you should do that. But anyway, setting that aside for a moment, I think one of the sort of other, things we're sort of talking and not talking about is the role of artificial intelligence in all of this, right? And let me just use that excellent question to tee this up. One of the major issues of artificial intelligence for privacy is that artificial intelligence is increasingly able to derive the intimate from the available. And what I mean by that is that when you share things about yourself in public or with a social network that you think is innocuous, it is conceivable that by virtue of their lens and their pattern recognition technology, that they can suddenly derive something about you that you don't want them to know. You may be fine with Target knowing your purchase history, but you do not want them to be able to accurately guess that you are pregnant, let alone send coupons to your house and have your dad open them and say, "When am I going to go?" Which actually literally happens. So that's I think a lot of it is you can't do this kind of scary pattern recognition if you don't have access to all this different data. So it's like we're kind of all in it together, kind of literally, and I think that that's a valid concern. Yeah.
So we're at the point where both are equally terrifying? Both
Everything
the
is
aggregate
scary.
and the individual?
Yeah.
Super. Okay, next.
All right, so this is completely infeasible at the moment, but there's a concept of secure multi-party computation whereby, say, Google shares an encrypted set of all their ad bids and all the things that advertisers want to target, and then you provide an encrypted version of all of your tracking data, and then they get combined in some secure way where neither other party learns what that secret data is, but you still get these highly targeted ads do you think people would accept that, or would it still creep them out?
I think that, Carl, I think they shouldn't accept that, right? And here's why. Technically, you don't need to know who this person is to disadvantage them, right? So let me give you an example.
Yes.
Why does everything cost $9.99? Right? Everything costs $9.99 because they tricks your brain into seeing it as being a further distance from $10 than it really is. So what if firms, our companies, are increasingly able not to charge you $9.99, but to figure out what your particular reservation price is? In other words, what's the highest amount you'd be willing to pay for something, right? So let's say they use a highly encrypted version of doing that, and yet still you wind up paying more for something because they figured out that your reservation price is higher than your neighbor's. The fact that they don't know who you are, so what? Right? Your data has become fodder for being manipulated and harmed. So I mean, I like those techniques. I think they're a good idea in many contexts. I think they protect us largely from the government, but I don't think that they help the manipulation potential of this stuff.
Because they don't change the categories. You could still get digitally redlined. You could still not see job ads because employers, and this happened on Facebook, are able to say, please don't show this ad to people of color or women.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, I don't know who they are. So what? You were racist.
Right.
You were, you know what I mean? Like,
So what,
it's not okay, right?
Yeah. Fascinating, yeah. Sorry, blockchain people. It's not going to work. I know you're out there. Sense you.
Hi. So I think it's important to couch this question in the idea that I'm still a fan of privacy regulation and even like regulations on tech companies and stuff. But you've talked about not wanting to allow targeted advertising, and you've talked about a difference between contextual advertising and targeted advertising. And I'm curious, what do you think ads are? Do you think that ads aren't trying to change your behavior? Do you really think that if you're reading a soccer article that all they know about you is that you might be interested in soccer, that a television show isn't targeting its ads based on your age, race, location, gender, number of children, political affiliation, other shows you might like, other products you might buy? It seems to me that the only difference here is a little bit in degree, like Nielsen ratings certainly predated anything that Zuck did. And then second of all, that the availability of space. If we all open up our phones here and pull up the Facebook app, which statistically almost everyone in here has, we're all looking at a different screen, and they can serve all kinds of different ads to all of us. But if we turned on these monitors or whatever to a basketball game, we're all watching the same game. So I don't know if I quite understand how you can possibly ban targeted advertising without banning advertising, or how there's really much difference other than degree and space in contextual advertising and targeted micro ads from the internet.
Good question.
Good question. Yeah.
I think that
And capitalism.
a big difference is in profiling, which we've been talking about quite a bit. I think there is a difference between your browser history, cookies that follow you around the internet and give a company an idea of what you might be interested in, and companies that pay a huge range of data brokers to feed them information about you from all these different sources, whether it's using your credit card at the grocery store or what have you, and then create a picture of who you are, because then those profiles can be used for more than just advertising. They can be used for political gains, which we saw in Cambridge Analytica. And I think that is something that you can actually target. Profiling is the subject of Washington's bill that's under consideration right now. I don't know if I've seen it in other bills. It doesn't ban it, but it compels companies to tell users why they're profiling them and if they're doing it, if they're collecting information from different sources. So I think that's a really important part of this discussion that could be unpacked a little more.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Nielsen or the TV advertising example is actually a great counterargument, right? There's no feedback loop in TV advertising, or there's very little feedback loop in TV advertising. The challenge with online advertising and the extent to which we're targeting is that feedback loop ties back to your notion of your digital identity. The vast majority of people in here are probably using a Chrome browser. They're probably signed into their Google account because they're using Gmail, and they're having a lot of their online activities being attributed back to that notion of digital identity. Whereas if you happen to fit within a particular demographic that likes or is observed to enjoy watching a particular TV show, you still have you have many degrees of anonymity or freedom within that demographic. And it doesn't tie back to other types of activities that you're conducting online for the point I was making earlier about correlation. So I think that they are fundamentally different. And I think that, it's only within the very recent past that we've seen this degree of targeted advertising. We've had plenty of ads without this degree of targeted advertising. So I'm not sure I understand why banning targeting to this degree means that advertising as a whole would end. Believe me, I would love to have advertising go away, right? I hate ads, but I also recognize there's a role for them and there's a necessity around them. I just think that it's gone to an nth degree that's a bit too far.
Hi, thanks again for coming. My question's about up and coming in the next couple of years, 5G. And specifically the Internet of Things, IoT, and especially around smart city technology. Is there just going to be a point where there is so many relays for gathering information that you're not going to be able to insulate yourself? And how is that going to be monetized when there's just so much information constantly coming in? Is that going to increase, or is it just going to stay the same, do you think?
This is a big part of Shoshana Zuboff's big book about how the idea that this extraction of data is now making its way not from just the digital world, but to the physical world based on those physical interactions. Is there a chance we get enough regulation in place before that?
Well, I think that we need to, yesterday, start talking about who owns this data when we move into smart cities and the Internet of Things. It's playing out in Toronto right now. Sidewalk Labs, which is part of the Google umbrella, is developing this little innovation district, like a mini smart city, that's going to have sensors embedded in everything, so they say, and be collecting all this data. Yeah. And they haven't really said definitively who owns or controls that data, but ostensibly, this is a private company that's building these things. And cities, governments contract with private companies all the time. So I think that conversation needs to be had way before any information is collected. The information that is collected needs to be really thoughtfully anonymized and aggregated. And I think open data initiatives that a lot of cities are adopting, where they're working to be really transparent with citizens about what and how this data is collected, are also tools. But it's kind of a scary reality because we've never done it before, right?
Mm-hmm. But as to that basic question, it's going to be built in.
Well, it's happening here in Seattle, right? So Seattle City Light is pushing out smart metering for measuring how people are using electricity. And there's published research that shows that, depending on the type of monitoring that you're doing, you can pick up signatures on the types of appliances that people have in their home and what they're using. And Seattle has a chief privacy officer, and this prior CTO was kind of involved in this engagement. And that privacy officer came into play because citizens stood up and said, we want to have somebody helping oversee these types of projects. I think that there's just a lot of questions that need to be answered, but I kind of caution us against this privacy nihilism, right? That we're going to be collecting all the data, and therefore we just have to give it up and we just have to live with the consequences of it. I think we can have a hand in exactly what gets gathered, how it gets used, who owns it, and who's got access to it. We just have to speak up for that.
Sure. And there's an opportunity to do that in Seattle right now. The city is considering a bunch of new technologies to have as part of its surveillance ordinance and taking public input on what should be included in that. So you can talk to the city.
I love an action item. Ryan.
So I have a couple of observations here. One of them is not original to me. My colleague Batya Friedman at the university mentioned this to me. So one issue is that there's this weird push to instrument everything. We need to have sensors in our city streets and our rivers and our trees and everything. And everywhere. And when you ask, well, why? Well, because, we'll figure out the real problems with, global warming or deforestation. The truth of the matter is that the reason that we're not addressing environmental problems is not because we have insufficient data. It's because there's a phobia about science, and there's not the political will, and we're greedy, and so on. You know what I mean? We have to ask ourselves consistently, why are we bothering to gather this data, right? So this is Batya's very good insight. What I would say about my own experience is, I think that often I think Shoshana's book does this to some extent. I think a lot of scholars in this space do this, which is that we focus rather relentlessly, rather specifically on the potential for collection of information. So we worry about the Internet of Things because all of a sudden there's a bunch of sensors in your house and there's more information, more information, more information. To me, the most important thing about the Internet of Things and about smart voice-activated devices like Echo and so on, the most important part about things is not the fact that it's collecting information about you, but rather that it's able to reach you anytime, right? So for example, there was an astonishingly disgusting marketing data that I once saw, research data, that suggested that having done the research, this just brutal marketing firm determined that there's a time when women feel the worst about how they look, and that's on Monday mornings. And therefore, this marketing research firm concluded that's when you should advertise beauty products to women because they feel the worst about themselves. Now, that is gross, okay? I remember The Atlantic ran a story about this when I was in, is this the grossest advertising of all time? And I resoundingly yes, I think it's among the worst. Now, but here's the thing. How are you going to reach somebody at Monday morning? You know what I mean? I mean, the truth is that nowadays you got to rely on people to go online or go outside or go to a store or whatever. Increasingly with the Internet of Things, you have the potential to reach anybody, anytime, anywhere, right? That's the real danger here. And indeed, the Federal Trade Commission has recognized this in an analogous setting. The Federal Trade Commission says, according to the door-to-door sales rule, is that if someone comes to your house and markets to you, like sells you an encyclopedia, you have special rules. You get to unravel it in a few days. There's certain restrictions around it. Why have a special rule like that? Well, the idea is that you're not wearing your consumer hat. You're just home. You're just, you're just hanging out. You know what I mean? This was a 1950s sort of innovation. So the idea was you're in your curlers and you're home from, you know what I mean, and so on. So it's a little gendered. But my point is that the idea is that you're home. You're not in your market. You haven't gone out to the marketplace to do battle. You haven't, rather you're being approached. You're being approached in this intimate moment, right? A lot of the danger here has to do not with the collection of the data, but the ability to use that data anytime, anywhere, and to reach you at your most vulnerable moments anytime. So to me, the idea that we're introducing these smart devices into our house is not smart. And the reason it's not smart is both the fact that it's collecting more data, but also it just keeps this constant contact between you and the corporation where they get to choose precisely when to pitch to you. You know what I mean? I think that dimension gets lost.
That's good. That's good stuff.
I mean, like, you're always on your phone, right?
You're not in line. Come on. We got time for one question left.
Yeah, no. So this is like sort of like a two-finger follow-up, right? What about your smartphone?
Look at that.
So okay, so you can answer. The question was for those of you who didn't hear it because he doesn't have a microphone. Is this? Well, what about your smartphone, Ryan? Sure, that's maybe what you're saying is right, but what about your smartphone? A couple things about that. So first of all, it could be a problem with the smartphone. Simply put, right? It's also a danger with a smartphone, But the other thing about it is, I think that's different. I think that when you use your smartphone for something, again, you are purposely going online, and it's unlikely, but possible, that people would try to use it to reach you. But to the extent that they can, to the extent that all of a sudden right now, Amazon can be like, Ryan seems agitated. I'm going to advertise something to him. Yeah, exactly, to him. And my phone started to ring because of that. That would be a problem. One example I've used in my research is, imagine that you're using an app on your smartphone, and you're using it as a fitness tracker, okay? And it can see that you've gone for like a long run, and you're using it because you're trying to lose weight, right? And so what happens is at the end of your long run, you're feeling really good. And then all of a sudden, you get a text message. And the text message says, did you know that there's a Dunkin' Donuts really close to you? Right? Because the fitness app has went and told somebody that you're at a moment where you're really hungry, right? That's messed up. I think it's messed up. So yes, also your smartphone.
Right. But what you're talking about is moving to ambient computing, we are. Yeah, exactly. We have time for one more question, but don't worry, we'll be mingling around there for a little while after, so you'll be able to jump the line out there.
Thank you for taking the question from the guy in line.
Oh, man.
So Warren's antitrust proposals and a lot of our conversation tonight is expressing suspicion at scale, the scale of the data gathering. I was at a talk at RSA last week where Gmail gave a talk about how they have virtually solved the problem of phishing, which is the scourge of everyone's inbox. And the way they've solved it is because of just the massive amounts of data that they've got coming through their servers. They've got 100 million emails passing through their servers every single minute, I think was their statistic. And it's only that volume and that scale that's allowed them to develop the intelligence to filter it out primarily before it gets to you, and then to give you the tools as a user to take the next steps. So there are areas where I think scale is tremendously beneficial. And so my question is, how do we retain the benefits of scale while not letting it eat us alive?
Mm-hmm. I would love to know, was John Podesta listening to that presentation? Because he actually got phished with a Gmail account.
Oh, yeah. It's still, they did say it's still possible.
Yeah, it's definitely still possible. I mean, I think so. A little background, prior to starting Helm, I was at a security company. They had previously acquired another security startup that I'd started. And we built a huge platform that sought to gather as many security events as we possibly could with this underlying thesis. I mean, you went to RSA, you see this, like all the security companies there are talking about, we do apply deep learning to try to find anomalous events and help you understand like where are there security challenges that you should be paying attention to. Have you bought any of those products? I mean, like I won't, say anything about the product that I worked on previously in my previous company. I mean, it has the same challenges that Ryan was talking about with AI. It's not really that different. I don't think we've seen that like we've turned the corner to having like effective solutions. So it's nice that they came and made that presentation. I personally am not a believer that just by virtue of having a tremendous amount of data that you're going to all of a sudden get a lot more effective. There's still a lot of noise to cut through to figure out like how do you build the right model to figure it out. And if you take a look at those products, you actually need to have a very savvy practitioner that knows how to figure out what to ignore and what to pay attention to. So there's still a human involved in the loop, I guess is what I'm saying, right? You still need people. I don't know that the data is going to just solve the problem for you.
I think there's no doubt that huge amounts of data can solve problems that humans never could, and there are incredible use cases for them. Facial recognition is a great example. Well, there are scary uses, but it can also be used to find missing children, to identify child pornography. I mean, there are all of these use cases that we don't want to discourage. I think the way that you address these things is with really nimble regulation. The Warren proposal is a pretty blunt instrument, but I think you need to know what you're trying to solve for. Is what you want to solve the size and wealth of these companies, or is what you want to solve the manipulation of its users? And write regulations with that end goal backwards.
Yeah. That's a great place to end. I'm sorry for those of you who waited in line for so long, but we will be right out there. Don't panic, just don't leave. Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks to our brilliant panel. How great are they? And before I let everyone off of our uncomfortable stools, I just want to say thank you to KUOW who brought me here to do this event. So wonderful. And this is the public radio part because you get to cut out the middleman with public radio. Your donations are what make all of our programming marketplace and everything that KUOW brings to you. So become an investor today. Thanks, guys.